So, by popular demand, this is the public housing episode. I'm still waiting for some assets to do the M-Track episode, so sorry about promising that and not delivering. That'll be coming soon, though. So, to my knowledge, the only game in the city builder tradition that really simulated anything close to public housing was SimCity 2000. It had arcologies, but those are a little different from your standard public housing tower, of course. Now that the state capitalism expansion is out, we of course have municipally owned factories, but public housing is still something that we can't simulate, at least without mods. So, public housing in the USA gets a really bad rap. It's overcrowded, or it's crime ridden, or it's ugly, or it's substandard, or whatever. Some people don't want to live near the public housing towers because they think 100% of the residents are in MS-13 or ISIS or something. Somehow, some way, the provision of public or subsidized housing immediately turns you into a moral degenerate and possibly a heroin addict, presumably via osmosis of government mind-controlled drugs in the paint or something. I don't know. The reality of this situation is actually somewhat more complicated than government mind control drugs. So I initially wrote this to be one episode and it just kept getting longer and longer and longer. So in fact, this is going to be the first episode in a two-part series. So in part one, we're going to talk about the history of public housing from the Victorian workhouse to the Housing Act of 1949 and slum clearance. I'll talk about the architecture of public housing, the Garden City and the Radiant City, a little bit about Red Vienna and Greenbelt, Maryland. Then we'll do some slum clearance and talk about the development that really sticks in people's minds when they think about public housing, Pruitt-Igoe in St. Louis. Part 2 is going to focus on public housing as it is run today and the slow and insidious creep of more privatization into public housing policy, especially in regards to a program called Hope 6, which lets public housing authorities replace subsidized public housing units with market rate units. This will also include some anecdotes from back when I worked for an unspecified public housing authority. We'll also talk about private affordable housing, Section 8, and Kanye West and Elon Musk. So, let's start with some history and some architecture. So, since we're going to talk about architecture, I got to get my grad student to get the slide projector out. Hold on a second here. Okay, so about as far back as I can trace this is the English Poor Law of 1601. It provided for the housing of the impotent poor, that is, anyone unable to work, in almshouses, which were parish-run apartment buildings for the poor. A lot of times you had to do a bunch of religious crap if you lived there. Next slide, please. So not too long after the passage of the Poor Law, some folks got the idea that the able-bodied poor in almshouses ought to work to reduce the financial burden of housing them. So the first workhouses were created. So in the workhouse, you did some menial task for 10 hours a day, you break some rocks or whatever, and in return you got food and a bed, usually in a room with a dozen other people. The idea behind the workhouse was to make it unpleasant, so people wouldn't go there unless they really had to. In fact, when the new Poor Law was passed in 1834, the concept of less eligibility was introduced. The language specifically stated that the most well-off workhouse dweller should live in conditions which were worse than the worst-off pauper outside the walls of the workhouse. Next slide, please. So one of the problems with the idea of life inside the workhouse being worse than life outside the workhouse was just how bad life outside the workhouse was. Life in the workhouse was by no means good, but you had medical care, and you probably weren't going to starve to death even in the worst managed workhouses. So less eligibility would really only work if the workhouse was actively trying to kill its inhabitants, in other words. Even with prison-like conditions and discipline, they just couldn't do it. Victorian England was that bad. So the workhouse system was the only functioning government housing scheme around at this point. Angie from Angie Speaks has a good video that does Victorian workhouses in depth. I'll link that in the description. Next slide, please. However, modern public housing concepts largely derive not from the Victorian workhouse, but from a different tradition. That's Ebenezer Howard's Garden Cities concept. So, Ebenezer Howard was a socialist and a Georgist. That is, he believed in the replacement of all taxation with a single tax on land value, which that could be its own episode eventually, I think. Next slide, please. So the Garden City concept was designed to move people, especially the working class, out of the overcrowded Victorian cities and into settlements which were less dense and surrounded by green belts. That is a sort of, green area around the city, trees, nature, all that stuff. A lot of folks take his diagrams literally, but these were all abstractions. One merely has to look at the actual garden city he got built, Letchworth, to see that this isn't the case. Next slide, please. So, Ebenezer Howard's plans, in addition to the physical form of the garden city, called for the cooperative ownership of land, the single tax, so on and so forth, but most of the socialistic ideas had to be dumped in order for him to get private investors to fund the one actual garden city he got built. He tried to get a few big worker co-ops to invest, but they didn't quite manage to get their backing. So the radical socialist garden city of tomorrow still had landlords, still had a housing market, and it had an obligation to pay dividends to the shareholders, and it quickly became unaffordable for the lower classes it was supposed to house. It was a financial success, but a social failure. And this demonstrates something extremely important which everyone ought to remember here. Next slide, please. Architecture alone cannot solve social problems. If you take away one lesson from this, that's it, right there. That has not stopped architects from trying, though. Next slide, please. Okay, so we got to talk about a Swiss guy named Le Corbusier. He's the modernism guy. I'm going to simplify this a whole bunch right now. Eventually I'll do a video called, Paul Joseph Watson Doesn't Understand Architecture, where we expand on this subject a bunch. Anyway, so, blah blah blah, Villa Savoy, blah blah blah, towards a new architecture, blah blah blah, a house is a machine for living in, blah blah blah, de Modulor, blah blah blah, Vichy Collaborator. Next slide, please. But we got to talk about two of Le Corbusier's most influential works, at least in regard to public housing: the Radiant City and the Unité d'Habitation. So the Radiant City was a concept for an idealized urban area involving large towers in the park, in which the bulk of the population would live. So at ground level, pedestrian and automobile traffic would be completely separated. Every apartment was going to be spacious, with apartments allocated according to need, so larger families get larger apartments. That was a development from his earlier contemporary city, which was envisioned in the 1920s along similar lines, but that was stratified by class. By this point in the 1930s, Le Corbusier was a syndicalist, though, so he changed that, obviously. Now, this towers in the park concept proved to be incredibly influential. Next slide, please. Could you flip that? Okay, so after the war and Corbusier's Vichy Collaborator phase, he, like many famous architects, only attached himself to the ideologies most likely to get him work. he tried to get a few commissions during the extensive post-war rebuilding era. His most influential project for public housing was constructed during this time, the Unité d'Habitation, or rather, several of them. So it's a big concrete tower block. It was supposed to be built in steel, but steel was in short supply after the war, so they built it in concrete and accidentally invented brutalism. Each apartment was 2 stories tall and had a balcony and a double-height living room. There was an internal street in the sky with a few shops halfway up the building. These shops usually didn't last long since their only customers were the residents of the Unité. It was very popular with its inhabitants and remains very popular with its inhabitants to this day. In short, it's pretty good design. Next slide, please. So this building, along with the Radiant City concept, was the direct inspiration for almost all high-rise public housing in the United States. But we know, of course, that high-rise public housing in the United States is considerably less popular with its residents than the Unité is. So, what happened? Well, we gotta move on from architecture and talk about policy. Right, so I'm going to talk about 2 contemporaneous public housing schemes right here, Red Vienna and Greenbelt, Maryland. Then we're going to talk about some later legislature and slum clearance policies, and Pruitt-Igoe in St. Louis. So Red Vienna probably deserves its own episode at some point, but I'm going to get the gist of it across. The Social Democrats... Look, all y'all are going to have to shut up for a second. I know they killed Rosa and all, but there's stuff worth learning about here. So the Social Democrats took power in 1918 and set about figuring out how to do socialism in one city. Up front, you have a couple of problems, of course, chief among which is this fun thing called capital flight. That's when the government passes a law that the capitalist class doesn't like, and so the capitalists up and move out of town to somewhere they do like, and then they write a 70-page speech, you know. Who is John Galt? I really don't care. So, anyway, capital flight is hard enough to deal with on a national level, but at the municipal level, it's almost impossible to prevent. You know, you're not going to put up a wall at the border of the city to keep the capitalists in. So the Social Democrats came up with a clever solution, which was large-scale public housing with artificially low rents. So think of it this way. You can't really enforce higher wages, and you can't really pass new significant taxes without causing capital flight. However, 30% of everyone's income is already going to rent, you know, or so. If you, say, brought that down to 4%, that's the equivalent of giving a 26% pay raise for everyone, especially those who make the least amount of money, who see the largest gains, since they're paying more of a proportion of their income in rent. So that's what the Social Democrats did. They absolutely minimized the rent in these new massive public housing developments, thereby leaving everyone with much more disposable income without requiring huge wage increases. And these complexes were huge. One structure, the Karl Marx Hof, is the longest residential building in the world to this day, at 0.7 of a mile in length. It has 1,382 apartments. It also served as a fortress for the Social Democratic Party in 1934 during the Austrian Civil War. And these projects were made possible by luxury taxes. You know, so that's taxes on the number of servants you have, on a number of automobiles you have, and also a new housing construction tax. These were a bit more palatable to the wealthy than straight-up income taxes, so you didn't have as much of a problem with capital flight, and the tax revenue went to maintaining these new buildings. Well, right as Red Vienna was falling to the Austro-fascists, Greenbelt, Maryland was being built. So the Resettlement Administration, or the RA, not to be confused with the other RA, was a New Deal agency, and it was going to construct 3 experimental towns based on Ebenezer Howard's Garden City principles on the periphery of major cities. Greenbelt, Maryland was one of them. The community was, and is, composed of a bunch of Art Deco low-rise apartment blocks around a central commercial area. Initially, the entire town was owned by the federal government and operated as a co-op, sort of according to Howard's principles, including the commercial area. So the government carefully selected tenants according to their prospective willingness to be involved in community activities and governance. Most of these tenants were young couples or single people, most at or below the poverty line, and of course all of them were white. So, welfare systems in America have historically been uniquely concerned with social control. Greenbelt was no exception. Now, you had a few rules established for residents in the community, including, simple stuff like bans on airing laundry at certain times of day, complete ban on pets, but also women weren't allowed to work. Furthermore, if a person bettered their financial position to the point where they were making over 25% of the upper income limit, they were served an eviction notice. So despite this, the community thrived. A cooperative newspaper was set up, several cooperative businesses set up shop, and the main grocery store there remains a co-op to this day. The federal government attempted several times to divest themselves of the town and sell it to private developers, to no avail. Eventually, the citizens bought the town themselves and continued to operate it as a co-op. Now, for the uncapitalistic action of purchasing their own homes, several co-op members were brought before the House Un-American Activities Committee under suspicion of being communists. But despite this, Greenbelt remains a cooperatively managed town to this day. So I'd throw both Red Vienna and Greenbelt into the pretty good category of public housing. Though Greenbelt was hampered by unnecessary tenant rules of conduct and an income limit, it still let the residents democratically control their own housing. Though Red Vienna didn't last long, it proved the practicality of radical housing schemes to materially improve the lives of a huge number of people. So, after World War II, the philosophy behind public housing changed radically. A huge portion of the urban population, both before and after World War II, lived in slums. What's a slum? What characterizes a slum? So you got old, rundown housing. You have overcrowding. It's multiple people per bedroom usually. A lot of time, no running water or sewage systems, up and including into the early 1950s. And ownership by slumlords who extracted rent and did not much else than that. There's a Gil Scott-Heron song called Waiting for the Axe to Fall, which of course I can't play here because, copyright, but the opening lyrics go, "Brother living in a cell, doing time in a county jail. Now you might think his life is hell, but he told me it's the first room he ever had to himself." And that's the reality of living in the slums. You got absurd overcrowding and a total lack of privacy to the point where maybe the county lockup is a little better than what you're living in. So there was a desperate need for both more housing and higher quality housing, which the market seemed unable to supply. So how are we going to build more high-quality housing? With the help of the government, of course. So before we start in on that, let's talk about the oldest trick in the book. So in an organization like a company or a federal agency which oversees both construction and operation of facilities meaning, any kind of building, infrastructure, whatever, you have two budgets. You have the capital budget and the operations budget. The capital budget pays for construction and major renovations, so like a new housing tower or a big chiller and associated HVAC ducting or something like that. And the operations budget, in turn, pays for day-to-day maintenance, employee salaries, overhead, and so on and so forth. So the capital budget usually allows for big contract awards and ribbon cuttings and other stuff that the politicians like, while operations is boring day-to-day stuff like replacing light bulbs and paying the janitor. So here's the oldest trick in the book, which has been employed again and again to cripple federal programs. You fund the capital budget in full, but insist that operations have to be self-sufficient somehow. This technique has been tried again and again to defund and cripple anything from public housing to transit to any social service you like. And there is literally no reason why any of these programs should be self-funding, by the way. In the United States, we have a thing called fiat currency. That means you can print the money or you can borrow the money. And either one isn't a terrible idea so long as it's done in moderation. The federal government can come up with any amount of money it needs to. And it does this regularly to the tune of trillions of dollars each year and hands that money right over to Boeing, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, General Atomics, Raytheon, General Dynamics, and so on. The deficit boogeyman mostly ensures that folks fret and worry about funding social services and infrastructure while, each year's defense budget increase, to say nothing of the whole defense budget, could fund a lot of existing levels of social services for years. There's an episode of the podcast Citations Needed about this, which I'll link to in the description. But, the answer to questions of how do we pay for it is always, we just pay for it. And Matt Lesko was right. But because of how American politics work, we got to go along with this farce that deficit spending matters. So with that in mind, let's talk about the Wagner-Steagall Housing Act of 1937. So Wagner-Steagall was agitated for by the Labor Housing Conference, which was primarily a group of radical workers from the Philadelphia-based American Federation of Full-Fashioned Hosiery Workers, along with architect Oscar Storanov and expert on European public housing, Catherine Bauer. Eventually, with the backing of the American Federation of Labor, they got a bill passed, but it wasn't the bill they wanted. As originally envisioned, Wagner-Steagall would create more periphery communities like Greenbelt, Maryland, which would add to the housing supply rather than replace it. And it'd keep existing neighborhoods intact. However, the legislation that was passed wound up instead focusing on improving the housing supply rather than adding to it. In order so as to not distort the market, public housing projects could, at most, provide a one-for-one replacement for private units it demolished. Public housing on a greenfield site was not allowed at all. Every public unit constructed required a private unit to be demolished. Many projects didn't even provide a one-for-one replacement, so public housing actually constricted the housing supply. Mass demolition of private housing for public housing projects became known as slum clearance, sometimes Title I slum clearance, referring to the specific provision of the act which provided the federal funding. In addition, extremely low maximum income requirements were imposed, and while the federal government provided capital funding, operations were expected to be paid through the project's rents. Also, since control was devolved to local public housing authorities, many early projects were segregated or blocked entirely by wealthy communities. Now, slum clearance became almost entirely detached from building public housing after World War II by the Housing Act of 1949. This act allowed public money to be spent on slum clearance, which provided no kind of low-income housing at all. These slums could be replaced with stadiums, theaters, luxury condos, or whatever, entirely with federal money. It was effectively a massive handout to developers in the name of urban renewal. And the methods of slum clearance could warrant their own episode, but it frequently went something like this. The city took possession of slum properties, tenements, rooming houses, sometimes some single-family houses, through purchase or through eminent domain. These were turned over to a private contractor who would construct the housing project. The contractor would eventually construct the project, but sometimes they'd just sit on the properties and extract rent for a few years first. And once the project was built, it was then turned over to the housing authority to operate. Okay, so I've watched a few YouTube premieres, and they're really frustrating when they go really long, since there's no pause where I can go get a snack or a beer or something. So to alleviate this, I'm doing an intermission. We'll be back in about 2 minutes, and then there's about 30 minutes of video after that. If you don't need to go grab a snack or a beer or something, feel free to talk amongst yourselves in the chat.
Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby to get ourselves a treat.
Delicious things to eat.
The popcorn can't be beat. The sparkling drinks are just dandy. The chocolate bars and the candy. So let's all go to the lobby to get ourselves a treat. Let's all go to the lobby to get ourselves a treat.
Okay, we're done with the intermission. So let's look at a slum here in the 52nd Street neighborhood, which we've talked about in previous episodes. It's a row house neighborhood with a few apartment buildings, mostly lower to middle income residents. So we got to remember that in terms of Title I slum clearance, there are two kinds of slums. First off, you got your dilapidated, worn out, and substandard housing, which is unfit for human habitation and which desperately needs modernization or replacement. That's your traditional kind of slum, right? The second kind of slum is much more interesting. The second kind of slum is anything planners or developers find convenient to call a slum so they can acquire it via eminent domain. So this neighborhood falls into the second category. June, year 1. Okay, so remember Mrs. O'Leary from the Highways episode? This is Mrs. O'Leary's house. She's a recent widow. She lives alone with her 2 cats. She just paid off the remains of her mortgage, though. She's relying on renting an apartment in the house and her Social Security to pay for her retirement. Her compensation was $50,000 and a Section 8 voucher. And most Section 8 buildings in the neighborhood have strict no pets policies. Let's say she found an apartment within the project area a few years ago with her cats. So the boundaries of the project site are as follows. And of course her apartment is within that area. Now, several towers are planned on the site, and the city government selects Progress Realty Partners, located at 1209 North Orange Street, Wilmington, Delaware, along with 284,999 other corporations, as the primary contractor. So, to begin the project, the city government condemns and takes possession of the buildings and housing within the project site and turns them over to Progress Realty Partners. So, if you were a homeowner, now you're a renter. Your rent checks go to PRP. If you were renting, your checks now go to PRP. For a couple years, this is pretty much the only change in the neighborhood. PRP simply milks what the city considered a slum for rental income while, failing to do repairs or improvements. Some frustrated former homeowners move out, and PRP actually goes through the trouble of finding new tenants for those buildings rather than leaving them vacant, even though they know they're eventually going to demolish them. So, June, year 3. So eventually someone in the government starts turning the thumbscrews on PRP management to get them to actually get the project underway. So to begin the process, PRP sends out eviction notices giving folks 30 days to vacate. So this first round of eviction notices is illegal and unenforceable, but that's not the point. The point is to start making vacancies any way they can so the project can proceed. PRP has an obligation from the city to humanely relocate the existing population, but that task is impossible. When you clear slums, you're displacing not dozens or hundreds of people, but thousands or even tens of thousands. These folks have different wants and needs in housing and have different abilities to pay rent. If the area designated a slum has largely below market rates compared to the surrounding area, which it usually is, then it's very difficult to rehouse folks in comparable apartments in the area. So PRP can't really legally kick people out until the end of their lease, and they can't really just turn people out in the streets en masse because that would be a violation of their rehousing obligation so blatant that even the government might take notice. So the first illegal eviction notice still gets some number of folks to move out. They may genuinely believe the eviction was legal, since plenty of folks don't understand their rights as a tenant, or they may just see the writing on the wall and they might have the means to get out before stuff gets nasty. These newly vacant units are not refilled. So Mrs. O'Leary, remember, knows enough to know she can't be kicked out until her lease is up. And so she stays and attempts to apply for relocation assistance from PRP's local office. But the local office has irregular and unposted hours. After 6 weeks of trying, she finds it open one day. They offer her $800 to help with the moving expenses, and they show her some apartments in other areas of the city, far away from her neighborhood and her community. And these are either much more expensive than her current apartment, or completely substandard or in a dangerous neighborhood, most frequently all of the above. So she declines and resolves to find a place herself before her lease is up in January. Okay, December, year 3. PRP has identified the area around Mrs. O'Leary's house as having a slightly higher concentration of new vacancies than the rest of the project area, and so this is where the first mass relocation will start to make way for the first tower. So as leases expire, PRP refuses to renew them, but they offer to relocate tenants to the only apartments readily available to PRP, which are other apartments within the project area, on a month-to-month lease. And that month-to-month lease is around $200 a month higher than their previous rent. So folks with no other option take this option. Mrs. O'Leary has not found another place yet because the city's pretty well full up. So upon expiration of her lease, they move her into another building a block away, most of which had been boarded up for the past 6 months, since most of the tenants left early. Vandals have broken in and stolen the copper pipes. The common areas are trashed. PRP makes some token attempts at making the place livable, but since this building is also eventually slated for demolition, even those repairs are done as cheaply as possible. The heating breaks on the first sub-freezing day of the year, and it takes another 4 weeks to get it fixed. It breaks again in another week. February, year 4. So the building next door to the building Miss O'Leary has been relocated to is completely vacated, while the other adjacent building is under demolition. An errant brick from the demolition smashes one of her windows. PRP claims it'll be fixed soon, but they never get around to it. She's forced to board up the window herself to prevent her indoor cats from escaping. Uh, Demolition debris litters the adjacent streets, while squatters take up residence in some of the now vacant buildings, and illegal scrappers raid vacant apartments for anything valuable. More and more tenants begin leaving the neighborhood as it becomes increasingly unlivable, while in the meantime the public housing towers begin to rise on the newly vacant lots. July, year 4. Mrs. O'Leary, now on a month-to-month lease, is informed that her lease will not be renewed again, as her building is now scheduled for demolition. The company will relocate her again to another building another block away, also within the project area, for only $200 a month more. Still unable to find alternative living arrangements in such a short time, she agrees. Now, this new building is in even worse shape than the one she just left. The lobby is littered with broken glass, the electricity is intermittent, most days the building doesn't even have hot water. Nevertheless, she makes do while trying to find a way out of the project site. PRP offers to cover her moving expenses if she can move out of the project site, but with thousands of other tenants in the same predicament, apartments are pretty hard to come by. September, year 4. She's moved again. Rent is hiked another $100, and she winds up in a studio apartment with boarded up apartments on both sides. Those are quickly inhabited by squatters. December, year 4. She's moved again for another $100. This apartment has a toilet in the kitchen. Most of her Social Security check is going directly to Progress Realty Partners at this point. March, year 5. Again, to a single-room occupancy building. This one's still mostly occupied, but her room is barely large enough to fit her possessions, which are still boxed up because she knows she'll be moving again. June, year 5. The first of several new public housing towers are completed by PRP and its subcontractors, and it is handed over to the local housing authority for operation. The waiting list is 10,000 people long. Only those with the lowest income and least means to support themselves qualify. Now, Mrs. O'Leary, who's dependent on Social Security, does in fact qualify and is given an apartment in the new housing tower, and her long nightmare is over. It's a spacious one-bedroom, it's completely modern, has beautiful views, modern appliances, and central air. And rent is only a little higher than the place she started out in. Now, she's exceptionally lucky. Less than 10% of those who are in the project site qualify for housing in the new project, and even fewer of them will make it on the waiting list in time. So, what just happened? What you do during slum clearance is you start to really shuffle people around a bunch within the project area. Once you've harassed enough families with the means to move out, you can start shoving people from the most vacant buildings to ones with fewer vacancies, then demolish those newly empty buildings. You can also hit those families with a rent hike simultaneously, giving them more incentive to leave. During slum clearances for New York City public housing, orchestrated by Robert Moses, who I can't believe we're only talking about now for the first time on this channel, families were frequently shuffled from building to building half a dozen times or more in a single year, with a rent hike each time. Since these buildings were all slated for demolition, of course, maintenance was pretty minimal. The heating failed, the water was shut off, intentionally or unintentionally, windows broke and were never fixed, and generally life was made as miserable as possible for those who were unwilling or unable to move out of the project area. In the meantime, you start construction on the cleared area of the project, while demolitions are still ongoing in other areas, frequently adjacent to still occupied buildings, to cause maximum noise and dust and generally inconvenience the remaining tenants to encourage them to leave. Token efforts at providing relocation assistance were provided, like paying for moving expenses and showing some apartments to soon-to-be displaced tenants. These apartments were almost universally more expensive than the slums being cleared, and usually the relocation agency had many more tenants to relocate than apartments available. So, in short, if you lived in a slum being cleared, you got screwed. So, now that you've learned how these projects are built, let's look at how they're maintained. Let's look at Pruitt-Igoe. So, Pruitt-Igoe was designed as a modern public housing project to replace a neighborhood which was actually a slum, not a fake slum to hand out to developers in St. Louis. It was initially designed to be segregated, but segregation was made illegal while it was under construction, so that idea got tossed out. It comprised 33 11-story buildings, totaling 2,870 apartments. By the way, you can get this story in much more detail from the Pruitt-Igoe myth, which is currently available in full on YouTube, so I'll put the link to that in the description. Now, these towers, when they were first built, were modern, clean, spacious, air-conditioned, and so on. When the tenants moved in, everyone was mostly happy with their apartments, and, you had a pretty harmonious community for a while. But some financial issues started to creep into the project pretty early on. So, this thing called the Federal Housing Administration was offering extremely low-cost financing on suburban homes across the country. This essentially meant that owning a home in the suburbs was almost universally cheaper than renting in the city. So, racial covenants had been made illegal in 1948. That's a stipulation that you can't sell a plot of land to people of a certain race. So there was no legal way to discriminate by race in Federal Housing Administration mortgages. But that never stopped a mortgage broker before. You could throw out any application for any reason, so long as you didn't mention race was the reason. So in St. Louis proper, whites were leaving the city to take advantage of low-cost mortgages in the suburbs. A lot of blacks were moving in from the south, but not at the rate to replace the whites who were leaving. Meanwhile, a major housing project had just been completed, which was designed to serve a growing city, which was now shrinking, and the project was not financially stable unless it was fully occupied. Do you see a problem here? So, while Pruitt-Igoe was fully occupied when it opened, it started to empty out fairly quickly. And there are a couple reasons for this beyond simple racism. We have to go back to the United States welfare system's bizarre tendency to attempt to control and coerce folks' behaviors. Right, so a well-meaning policy, which we still sort of have today, is that public housing is reserved for the lowest-earning folks with the least ability to earn income, which, in the Pruitt-Igoe era, meant black single mothers, since motherhood was still considered a full-time job and the authorities assumed you'd be unable to support yourself. So if you wanted out of the slums and into the new, modern, clean public housing system, you either had to be a single mother or you had to fake it. And a lot of folks, desperate to leave the slums, faked it. So this incentive structure led to perverse outcomes. Fathers would deliberately move out of state so that their children and wives would be eligible for public housing. Families had to keep up a farce that the father had left for cigarettes and never come back or something like that, when in fact he was living just across the river in some East St. Louis hell shack, and he made sure to visit most days. Now, this situation was well known to the housing authority, who would actually send in inspectors to folks' units to make damn well sure there wasn't a happy and healthy nuclear family living in the unit. If they found a father in what was supposed to be a single mother's unit, then everyone got the boot. Fathers had to hide in closets or cupboards whenever the inspector came around. And this is in addition to the fact that you'd be kicked out of your apartment if you made too much money, or for a whole host of trivial other things. Sometimes I think that conservatives are onto something when they talk about American welfare as being a method of social control, but it damn well does not manifest in the ways they think it does. Your normal conservative complaints about, deadbeat black fathers ring kind of hollow when, the benefits are entirely inaccessible to intact families. Anyway, so we have a black population with largely subsidized rent in this public housing complex. We also have a white population, which is quickly moving out of the project and into the suburbs, which are accessible to them. The project can't fully fund its own maintenance without being filled up with mostly unsubsidized tenants. So we can see insolvency staring us in the face here. By 1965, the project was only 2/3 occupied, with that population level still falling. Vacancies were distributed pretty evenly. That is, every building and every floor still had some number of occupants, so you couldn't really downsize maintenance by mothballing some buildings. So they started to defer maintenance, right? So trash began to pile up in front of the incinerators, hallways weren't cleaned, safety patrols were cut, elevators broke and were never fixed. Light fixtures were replaced with new vandal-proof light fixtures, both more difficult and more expensive to replace, and more tempting for would-be vandals. Windows were broken and went unreplaced for weeks at a time. The place started to fall apart. And anyone who could get out of the project started trying to get out of the project. Those who stayed essentially wound up in unlivable conditions. 16 of the 33 buildings were completely vacant by 1971. It is vacant except for squatters, many of whom engaged in criminal activity from the completely unwatched buildings. The police began to refuse calls from the development since squatters and residents alike would pelt responding squad cars with bricks from upper floor apartments. It is about the only way to make their displeasure with the management of the complex known. But that's obviously not to say that was the only resistance. Far from it. In 1968, the residents of Pruitt-Igoe, led by Bertha Gilkey, went on a 9-month rent strike to protest the conditions of the development. An organized contingent of residents collected the rent each month and held it from the housing authority until they received their demands, including a comprehensive plan to fix Pruitt-Igoe. By the end of the strike, they had won a commitment from the housing authority to better maintain the buildings and find a long-term solution. But the long-term solution they came up with did not include Pruitt-Igoe. The first buildings were demolished in 1972. The less than 20-year-old buildings were imploded on national television, and a lot of people say with them went the nation's confidence in the ability of government to solve their problems. By 1976, the entire development was gone, and the community scattered throughout St. Louis and beyond. So, the residual memory of Pruitt-Igoe tends to be what we think of when we think of public housing in the United States. But is it really the case that all public housing developments descended into mismanagement and madness? No, not by a long shot. New York City has dozens of high-rise public housing projects at all income levels. New York City also never stopped growing, even in the bad old days. Certainly some neighborhoods started emptying out, but the city overall kept getting bigger. So a public housing policy that required full occupancy to keep the buildings maintained worked okay. Not fantastic, but it wasn't a failure. But the real thing I draw attention to here is that not all public housing projects are high-rises, and those non-high-rise projects tend to be more successful. Why is this? A lot of people point to the architecture. They'll say the proportions of a tower are inhuman, or somehow an apartment on the 10th story of an 11th-story building turns you into a monster, while the second-floor apartment of identical size on a 2-story building lets you remain an upstanding member of the community. But the real answer is a little more material than that. Small buildings are easier and cheaper to maintain. That's it. That's the whole answer. Economies of scale don't work too well for really big apartment buildings. The sweet spot is usually around 4 to 5 stories. If I'm running a public housing development with 2 to 3 story buildings, I don't need a bunch of elevators. I might need one at most for moving in and moving out, and for Americans with Disabilities Act compliance, which is important. I don't need a complicated high-pressure fire protection system. I don't need water pumps or a water tower. I don't need an on-site incinerator or commercial-scale trash collection. I don't need steel or concrete construction. I can get away with wood or load-bearing brick. I'll never have to worry about minor facade issues costing tens of thousands of dollars to fix, since I can just get a guy up there on a man lift in one day instead of contracting a specialized company to set up a swing stage 150 feet in the air. The 2-story building is just easier and cheaper to maintain. And if you're charging the same amount in rent that you do for the towers, you have more than enough money to maintain these smaller buildings. And chances are you are charging the same amount as you would for the towers. And, maybe you're making up some in subsidy or something. And the other part of this is the concept of eyes on the street. So in your big tower block, you don't have a view into the common areas, right? You don't see into the hallway until you open your door. You don't necessarily know what's going on in the hallway except for like some muffled sounds. You definitely don't know what's going on in the stairwell, despite the fact that you're going to have to use it if the elevator isn't working, which it often isn't. If the elevator is working, you don't know who's going to be on there or what's going to be in there, which is bad if you're going to be stuck in there for a while with another person you don't necessarily trust. In your 2-story building, you have a direct view onto the street through your front window. You know what's going on, and folks out there on the street know they might be being watched. So there's a little less chance for shenanigans. So your 2 to 3 story, fully funded public housing buildings are largely successful. Your fully funded high-rise buildings, rare though they are also pretty successful, or at least they're okay. They might look kind of run down on the outside, and sometimes the surrounding landscaping isn't particularly well maintained, but they're livable. They're okay. They're certainly no worse than comparable private sector units at the same price. And folks realize this. The waiting lists for traditional public housing are still huge. However, capital abhors public control where profit can be made, so our public housing is under assault. That story is going to have to wait for part 2, though. In part 2, we'll talk about the existing state of public housing in the United States in some more detail, and I'll tell some anecdotes about working for a modern public housing authority. And I'll talk about Hope 6, the program under which most public housing is built and, more importantly, demolished in the United States today. Okay, so that was the episode. Big thanks to Akita Builds for helping me with the script and some of the research. Here are a few channel updates, and then I'll do the commercial. This is my first regular episode since the Kotaku article, so hello to all my new subscribers. Thank you for watching my videos about cities. Our next goal after Kotaku is, of course, to get a condescending write-up in Market Urbanism Report, or maybe even City Lab. I've already been blocked by Streetsblog USA on Twitter, so my internet urbanist credentials are definitely in great shape. The first bonus episode on Killdozer is now up. You have to give me $1 on Patreon in order to see that episode, or you could pirate it. But if your time is worth $15 an hour, and it takes you more than 4 minutes to find a link to it, you're getting ripped off. That Patreon link is in the description, as is a Buy Me a Coffee link if you don't want to do monthly support, but you don't get the bonus episodes there. Furthermore, we're only 7,500 Patreons from beating the Lobster Guy in the Graphtreon rankings, which is all that matters. So please give me $1, if only to help prove the supremacy of cultural Marxism over whatever it is that Jordan Peterson teaches. It has something to do with pronouns, I think. I don't know. Follow me on the Twitter at Do Not Eat One, or if you don't like all the Nazis that are allowed on the bird site, follow me on Mastodon at Do Not Eat at mastodon.social. Okay, here's one last final postscript. So, unfortunately, Proposition 10 did not pass in California, and rent control is still illegal. However, despite this, someone decided it was still worth it to go to the San Diego office of the Alliance of Californians for Community Empowerment, who were a major backer of Proposition 10, and burn it down. They also burned a box of their t-shirts on the lawn for good measure, so, it was probably politically motivated arson. There's a link to donate to help them recover in the description. Speaking of t-shirts, we're going to have t-shirts soon. I ordered a test t-shirt and it turned out A-OK, so I will post a link about ordering t-shirts in the description and on the Twitter and on the Patreon when I get that completely working. Okay, now I'm going to shut up and we'll do the credits.